This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
And this is Zulfikar Ramzan from Aura.
Today, we're going to talk about intelligence safety. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. In the virtual studio today is Dr. Zulfikar Ramzan, Chief Scientist, Executive Vice President of Product and Development at Aura, and CEO of Aura Labs. Now, Zully has a PhD and 60 patents, but he's just a regular human being, and he's going to take a very typical problem that people have, and we're going to communicate in a typical human fashion. So, Zully, you got all those books behind you. Trying to fake and make people think you're smart or something?
Yeah, I wish I read half of them at this point, but...
I see. It's like fake books.
Actually, I think I actually have read most of them, but so I shouldn't say that. But, the technical books, not so much. Those are a bit harder to get through, but I've at least opened each one at some point.
Yeah. Well, the company we're talking about is Aura, A-U-R-A. You go to aura.com and get all kinds of information. But the problem we're talking about is a problem common to everyone on the planet, and especially to my federal listeners. It's identity and how to protect your identity online. Now, if I always talk about Joe's donut shop, if Joe's donut shop gets compromised, well, it's a problem. However, if the DOD gets compromised, then we got an issue. So let's paint the picture here and talk about identity, and especially for our federal audience, Zulfikar.
Absolutely. So I think for me, there was a pivotal moment that happened a number of years ago, which really kind of drove me to the space. I was actually at home. It was during the beginning of the pandemic. And if you remember this time, everybody was sheltering in place. Nobody was going anywhere. And, I was sitting in my home office. I just had finished a call and I heard my doorbell ring. And that was pretty unusual because baseline people just didn't come unsolicited, let alone during this whole shelter in place movement. And so I kind of go outside, I look through the people and I see my neighbor, and I will refer to him as Bob. It's not his real name, but I'm going to protect the identity of this person since I'm talking about identity protection. And, I kind of get my mask on, I open the door. He's kind of pacing outside and I was like, hey, Bob, what's going on? And, he looks at me and goes, I think I've been hacked. So I was like, oh, okay. And he knew I was working in cybersecurity. I was at RSA at the time. And so, he reaches out. I was like, well, tell me what's going on. So he showed me his iPad. And on his iPad is an email. And it says, dear Bob, we know you've been doing some things online you shouldn't have been doing. And we are going to tell your family that you've been doing these things online. And if you don't give us a payment of, and it was an amount in Bitcoin at this time, we will divulge all of your bad online habits to your family. And so I was like, oh, well, Bob, this is almost certainly likely to be a scam. They're just emailing anybody they can find. At this point, it gets kind of strange because he's like, well, maybe I did do some things online that I should have done. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was in a confessional booth, but on the side of the person receiving the confession. And this was a very awkward moment for me because Bob is this sort of grandfather figure. He's been my neighbor, an upstanding citizen. I did not want to know anything about his online habits or his confessionals. I was sure this was a scam of some sort. And it was a very awkward encounter, if you can imagine. And so I finally kind of settled him down, get him convinced that, he's not in any real danger at this point, but that he, given some of his online habits, he might want to consider thinking about how to protect himself in a more robust fashion. And at that point, he asked me the question, a very basic question was, hey, what should I go do? What should I do to protect myself? And in my head, I was like, well, I was thinking about 15 different products he needs to go buy. He needs antivirus. He needs something for identity theft. He needs a password manager. He needs a VPN, especially a VPN if he's going to be doing some of the stuff he implied he was doing online, and so on and so forth. And I kind of listed this out, and this was a lot to tell one individual, let alone somebody who was like an average consumer. He is maybe reasonably, tech savvy that he uses his iPad and he goes online, but he certainly does not have the sort of breadth of knowledge of the people that I typically interacted with at the time, which were, he was not a chief security officer or somebody who had like a CIO type mandate. He was just the average person trying to protect himself and his family. And so Right around that time, a good friend of mine, Hari Ravichandran, who was the founder of Aura, reached out to me, and he told me about the concept he was building at Aura. And really what Aura was focused on is the idea of providing comprehensive digital safety for consumers. And the idea there is that if we can truly provide one product that solves the breadth of problems that occur in the security domain for the average consumer, we can really provide safety at the broadest level in the digital world. And that idea really appealed to me, especially in that moment, because I wanted to avoid a chance encounter with Bob or somebody else in the future. And that's really what kind of got me involved with Aura. And that was the initial premise of the company. We've actually evolved since then. I actually joined Aura as part of the board for about a year and then transitioned into an operational role when I was talking to Hari. And we really sort of delved on this idea that it's not just about providing safety and putting these products together. The real magic will occur if you can have these products truly work in concert, take all the data you have and apply techniques from artificial intelligence and machine learning to really provide, in many ways, a force multiplier across the breadth of offerings and really get one step ahead of the threat actor. Now, what was beautiful about this idea is that I spent a lot of time working in AI and machine learning way before anybody thought it was cool. In fact, in some of my earliest work in AI, nobody even knows AI was being used for some of these problems. And so that idea just struck a chord in my mind. And I left RSA to join Aura a couple of years ago, and it's been an amazing journey ever since.
Well, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, and we got the Pentagon here. We got Marines. We got big tough guys, special forces, all kinds of big people think they're bulletproof, and they go online and they're not going to get attacked. They're not going to get hurt. But guess what? Iron Man was attacked. So even if you're in the Marine Corps, you're going to get it's equal opportunity attack, isn't it? It's weak and sickly John Gilroy, Marine Corps, and Iron Man. I saw that. I said, what's going on here? Were you responsible for that?
No, quite the opposite. I think I'm now I guess part of the team that's got to keep Iron Man safe, or and I think what John's referring to is we were lucky to have Robert Downey Jr. Become an investor at Aura, join our board, and he's now in many ways a spokesperson for the company, really kind of espousing my message, and it kind of aligns with his ethos. If you look at the roles he's played in his profession, he's actually the perfect kind of juxtaposition of somebody who is tech savvy enough, somebody who has to worry about these issues every day. These issues are not just for the average person. Every single person from top to bottom has to worry about them, no matter how good you are. Unfortunately, today, it's not just about how good you protect yourself. Our data is out there. It's everywhere, right? If you are a federal government employee, you've got your data in a set of federal government databases. The OPM example is a classic one of people with clearance. Now you've got to worry about how all those databases are protected, how that data is handled. A single breach, even if it's not your fault, can lead to your data being divulged and then being used later in identity theft and other types of attacks.
I don't think you're, on an island somewhere screaming about this or on top of a hill somewhere alone. I mean, this is a much bigger problem. In fact, everyone in the business, at least I know, reads the Verizon DBIR report, came out in June. And guess what? It should have been written by Zulfikar Ramzan. I mean, it talks about business email compromise, the human element. It talks about zero data. It's like, yes, it's like this is really nothing new. It's just a matter of solving it as something new, because this is a problem that's been around for long, and it's not going to go anywhere anyway. And they'll tax everybody. And I think there's got to be a way to protect your personal identity that is not going to allow and maybe leak into your professional occupation or the federal government.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a situation that, everybody today is going online more and more. Our lives are becoming increasingly digital. That was certainly fueled during the course of the pandemic, where people started supplanting many of their physical experiences with digital ones. We started doing more stuff over Zoom. We started attending birthday parties and weddings online. We started doing all of our shopping online, including groceries and so on and so forth. And when you kind of add all that together, the threat actors are there because that's where the money is. It's like Willie Sutton. That's why he robbed banks. It wasn't because he liked to rob them. It's because that's where he was following the money. Last year alone, Americans lost $10.3 billion, billion with the B, to online crime. Now, to put that into perspective, the cost of home burglaries in 2022, the same year, was $1.6 billion. And so we're talking about almost a factor of 6 or more in terms of how much online crime has taken off compared to physical burglaries. And we spend all this time and effort protecting our physical homes. We put in alarm systems, we put in locks on the doors, we think about all these safety mechanisms, and yet our digital dwellings have far more holes, have a far greater impact to us nowadays. And we spend little to no time thinking about how to protect those digital dwellings. Now, what's scary is when you kind of get into the pandemic movement, where all of a sudden people started working from home, the lines between the work life and the home life were significantly blurred. All of a sudden, somebody getting compromised at home or on their own could have a ripple effect to the organization, and vice versa. We may see situations where an organization getting compromised and losing user data could then have a ripple effect into individuals getting their identity compromised or their assets compromised in some way, shape, or form. And so I think that combination has been very potent, and it's exploded in the last few years. And we kind of saw this coming. We saw the writing on the wall. But I think with the rise of digital, which I think has happened at a much more accelerated pace than I think we all imagined, fueled by the pandemic, we are now in a position where it is a bit of a perfect storm, and we're trying to navigate our way through this perfect storm. I think the good news is there are companies, obviously Aura, one of them, really focusing on how we can make this experience simpler, taking all the same ideas we apply to the enterprise in terms of intelligence and AI and machine learning, and bringing that to the average consumer and providing a really compelling, easy-to-use experience that helps them navigate an increasingly complex and dangerous digital terrain.
Smart, simple online safety. That's what we're talking about today. Now, come on now. I'm a real smart guy. I can go to Google and type in my name and I can see what's going on. And I get my credit score. And so, but I think people, they have the Iron Man complex. Yeah, I'm an Iron Man. I know all that stuff. I'm not going to go through these bad sites. But what Iron Man doesn't know is maybe there's a movie about this, the other dimension, the dark web. I mean, what's going on in the dark web? I don't know. I mean, maybe a company like yours can say, hey, you're fine. I want them to say you're fine, but something bad happens. I'm not going to know that.
I think if we have to write this plot down, Iron Man of the dark web, that sounds like the next sequel. I think if it comes up, I think we should make sure we get this recorded and you should get your royalties in time. But no, I think you're spot on. I think it's two problems. One, there's certainly a knowledge gap, right? People understanding the different threats that are out there, being able to stitch the right pieces together. There's also a time element of it as well. Even if you knew how to do all this stuff, who's got the time to do it? Like, we all have busy lives. I manage IT for my household, right? But at some level, only I have so much bandwidth. I would rather a simple solution for myself, so I can spend more time with my family and not just spend time trying to manage internal IT. And I think that's the thing that was missing before. So there were consumer solutions looking at some of these problems. The challenge was that they were all, designed in many ways historically for the technical buyer in mind. The early days of antivirus, and the people who installed antivirus in the early days were highly technical, and that space evolved in a very similar way towards the technical buyer. But now we have a situation where you want to protect the average person who may not have the time or the knowledge of how to protect themselves, and you want to simplify that process for them. And that's, I think, a new frontier in the space, and it's not been fully cracked. And that's the goal for us, is how do we crack that problem. And by the way, it's not just about identity theft in many ways. I think you were really spot on earlier on. To me, security is not a monolith. It's a mosaic. It's full of nuances and subtleties. There's so many different elements of how to think about security. It's not just about identity theft. It's about antivirus. There's password management. There's being able to opt out of the data brokers and collect your data online. There's being able to scan the dark web for situations where your password might be there. There's parental controls. If you're thinking about how to manage things for a household. There is dealing with things like phone scams and SMS messages, which come every day, and they're increasingly suspicious, and so on and so forth. And when you look at this breadth of capabilities that threat actors are trying to exploit, we've got to come up with a solution in kind that helps us stem that tide in the most effective way.
We can all read the Verizon DBIR and talk to experts like you and say business email compromise, okay, human element, okay. But you want to take and maybe focus that into something real. Years ago when I was in college, I made the mistake of debating a philosophy major. Never do that. Never do that. And in the middle of the debate, he said, if you take text out of context, you get pretext. And I walked away. I didn't know that, but pretext. All of a sudden,
context, you get a con. I'm not sure if that's a good thing.
You get a con, pretext. But pretexting is an approach, and pretexting is what they do. It's a pretexting attack. What happens is someone will contact someone like me and say, "Well, looky here, John. This is the Zulfikar Bank, and we got to get this information about you." And all of a sudden, you get compromised. And so this has got nothing to do with sophisticated firewalls and antivirus and ransomware. It's got to do with humans being susceptible to attacks, and that's their pretext. It's a pretend, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, I think that, a good friend of mine, Neil Howe, who's based in the DC area, has this wonderful quote. He says that, humans have a flawed operating system. It's beautifully flawed, but it's flawed, right? At some level, every single one of us in a moment of weakness can be susceptible to the right type of ruse. Now, I think what's happened nowadays is this problem is going to get a lot worse. I would be remiss on a podcast about any form of technology, not to say ChatGPT at some point. It seems like we should just check that off the buzzword bingo card immediately. But if you think about what some of these new generative AI models, or just the use of AI in general by threat actors is going to imply, gone are the days, or soon to be gone are the days where these pretexting efforts were full of spelling errors and grammatical mismatches and so on and so forth. We're seeing threat actors become more sophisticated, use tools like generative AI to generate the right emails, to sound more intelligent. In some cases, if they're trying to impersonate somebody, they will find the actual speech patterns of that person and embed those speech patterns into their own pattern for being able to trick somebody into what's going on. And so we're seeing situations where there was one case that we dealt with recently at Aura where there was a grandmother who had gotten called by her grandson, and I put grandson, quote unquote grandson, who said he was in the middle of some tough situation, needed his grandmother to bail him out, et cetera. And the interesting thing there is that he referred to the grandmother on the call by a specific nickname that he only used with his grandmother.
Yeah.
And so these threat actors figured out, like they were able to glean, probably through information available online, that this is how this particular grandson refers to his grandmother. And they used that in their pretexting approach. So it sounded much more believable. Now you combine that with tools, there are tools right now for doing voice changing using AI. You can literally mimic anybody's voice right now with your words. You can spoof phone numbers and you can make it look like a phone call's coming from the right place. And all of a sudden, all the sort of signs that we're used to looking for, the ostensible signs for whether or not a situation is fraudulent, those signs are no longer quite apparent because there are ways to mask all those efficiencies by threat actors. And underneath the hood is where you have to actually look, but the average user is not given the resources or just does not have the knowledge to be able to look underneath that hood. And so part of our goal at Aura is to be the people who can look underneath, figure out what's going on, and then work around it.
And so this isn't just applications for consumers. This is also applications for enterprises and for the federal government. Is that right?
Absolutely. So we tend to work really closely with both large organizations as well as individuals. With large organizations, our real thesis is that if you want to protect a large organization, you've got to start with every single person, because every single person becomes a threat vector, a vehicle by which somebody can get into the organization. They can become the initial stepping stone, if you will. And so a lot of our customers in the enterprise space will get Aura's technology to protect their individual employees for two reasons. One is they don't want the individual employee to get compromised and then use that as a way to get into the organization. And secondly, especially in large organizations where they have data and there could be data breaches, they are worried that if something were to get leaked, they want to protect their employees in that sense. And I think in the federal government space in particular, this problem is much more acute because there's just so much data about employees in the federal government that is accessible in databases. And because of the breadth and the fact that the federal government is a major target for threat actors all over the world, the likelihood of that data becoming leaked in a meaningful fashion is extremely high. And it's really, it's the classic line, it's not a matter of if, but when it happens. And so to me, identity theft is this sort of gift that keeps on giving. Once you have had your identity information compromised or stolen, you can never get it back. And it's a matter of time before somebody exploits that information to cause you digital harm.
So if a federal technology leader is listening to this podcast, and they can go to aura.com and find more, but this would be like key personnel. This would be people who have administrative administrative privileges. How do you match who to use Aura with?
Yeah, I would say, obviously you would want to start with your high target employees. That's a great place to imagine. But then all the people who connect with them, like, for example, not just the head of an organization, but if you have an administrator or an admin, their system has to be protected as well, because they could be the stepping stone into a larger situation. And so in general, the cost of protecting every single person is actually not that much higher if you think about it. And the nice thing we've really done by bringing all these pieces together into one offering, we've been able to do it in a way that reduces the price point significantly. It's a classic kind of bundling play, where if you bundle the right offers together and pieces together in an intelligent way, then the overall cost of the good becomes much lower. We can then take that savings and pass it on to our customers. And the incremental cost for the average user is fairly low. And so in that sense, I think it's worth everyone's while. If you're an individual, just go to Aura.com. You have a 2-week trial. You can try us out there. If you're in the enterprise space, or if you're in the government space, or even in state and local government, reach out to us. We can figure out a way to help you out across the board and help your users get protected. But for me, the name of the game here is that this problem has been around, as you noted, for decades, right? And we've seen the Verizon DBIR. I remember before it even existed, it was, Symantec had their own,
20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember, being helping to co-author certain sections of some of these reports. And the same problems are being discussed. They become more sophisticated. They become more significant. We've seen that hockey stick shape, and I've seen that hockey stick shape kind of go up over. I've seen the kind of trajectory of it, and every time you look at that shape, it looks like a hockey stick. It's like, at what point are we no longer going to see the hockey stick and finally see things taper off? We're not there yet, as far as I can tell, because people are getting more and more digital every day, and that just creates a target-rich environment for threat actors who are, can exploit a variety of different mechanisms to get to you.
So when I read your title, I said CEO of Aura Labs, and I imagined you with the white coat on and a beaker. So what do Aura Labs do?
Right. So Aura Labs is kind of a division of Aura that's really focused on finding the next big things for the company, really driving Aura's innovation agenda. Now, one thing, I kind of sometimes think back about the term Aura Labs, and I wonder if it's the right term to use for us, because I think sometimes when you hear the word lab, it kind of connotes, doing science experiments and science fair projects, that sort of thing. Our number one goal at Aura Labs is to drive and advance the organization, really get technologies out to market, and see that technology transition happen. It's just like even Bell Labs in the early days. Bell Labs, if you look at the amount of value they created for the parent organization, it was incredible, right? They really were driving innovation, but actually driving real successful business results from that innovation. And so the early charter for us has been building out a lot of our AI platforms at Aura. And now many of those platforms are in production. We're using AI to protect people every day, which is wonderful. And we'll continue to kind of advance that agenda. And so to me, this is about, you have to do experimentation if you're working in brand new areas. I think innovation and experimentation go hand in hand, because by definition, if you are innovating, you're doing something no one's really done before, which means you're not going to get it right the first time. You've got to be able to iterate very quickly. And Hari, who's our CEO, was prescient enough to realize that if you really want to successfully innovate in any company, for this type of innovation, obviously many kinds of innovation, but where you're really talking about sort of disruptive innovation in a company, it has to be done by a group of people who are tied to the company, but are a bit shielded from what's happening day to day, because the way you develop software, if you're trying to innovate, is very different than the way you develop software if you're trying to take a mainstream product and continue to advance it. And if I can kind of take a step back, if you look at like a typical engineering leader, when they're building software, their mandate is that they have to have things that are very predictable. They have to know that at the end of this 2-week sprint, this is where I'm going to be. And I'm going to, work on X, Y, and Z and get to this point in time. And predictability and timelines are everything for an engineering leader of a traditional software company. Yeah. If you're trying to innovate, what has to kind of change is the way you develop software is different, because you're more likely to get things wrong, which means that predictability kind of goes out the window in some ways. And half of your bets are going to fail. Maybe more are going to fail outright. And you've got to learn to fail fast, iterate quickly. You're not talking about 2-week sprints. Sometimes we do something for a day or two, realize it's not the right approach. We switch, we pivot, and we keep working. And so the operating model for a disruptive innovation division of a company is very different from that of the operating model of the rest of the company. And so Aura Labs is kind of created specifically so that we could, in parallel, drive Aura's overall innovation agenda. We're not the only people innovating at Aura, but we're doing the kind of innovation in Aura that requires a lot of experimentation and failure. But our goal is to get ideas into production. And we've been very successful in the last year, especially. I've been kind of in this role now for about 18 months and change in an operational capacity. And we've already gotten several technologies out the door that are now part of Aura. Like we recently launched a product offering that can do protection against phone scams. So if you get a phone call, we've got an AI-based call assistant that can basically answer the call on your behalf, figure out what the caller's intent is, then tell you that intent, and then you can decide if you want to accept the call or not. And along the way, if we detect that the intent is fraudulent, we can block the call on your behalf. And so we use all the classical AI tech technology. We look at the speech coming in, we convert it to text, we apply natural language processing, which is really now in vogue. And we were doing this before, people were talking about ChatGPT as a way to even try to solve some of these problems. We were able to infer intents We also can go a step further. In many of our offerings now, we'll not just tell you that something is wrong, we can tell your family. So for example, if you're a head of household and you manage IT for your family, which many of us do when we're in tech, we can not only alert your family members that something may have happened on their system, but we can tell you, hey, John, by the way, your son may have done something online, put himself at risk, and we're providing that more comprehensive set of controls for the entire family. So it's not just, to me, initially we were thinking about safety in terms of point solutions. Then it became safety in a comprehensive way. Then it became intelligent safety. And now I'd say our mantra is intelligent safety for families.
Yeah. I'm listening to you for 25 minutes here, and I wrote down these two words you just said, infer intent. That just those two words, that is very, very hard to do. I mean, that's the real challenge. I mean, how can you use all this technology, petabytes of information, tons of smart people, but can you infer intent? Is he really trying to scam you or not? Or is it the little league kid asking for money at the front door? Infer intent, that's two simple words, but my. And talking about a separate organization goes right back to Clayton Christensen and Innovator's Dilemma, and have a separate room and make mistakes and don't be afraid. And it's a lot of the old things are just repackaged and they're working. So it's great. Well, unfortunately, here we're running out of time. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Zulfikar Ramzan, Chief Scientist, Executive Vice President of Product and Development, Aura, and CEO of Aura Labs. Thank you, Ramzan.
Hey, thank you so much, John.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.